Good morning and welcome to Ask the Expert. I'm Joe Taylor. This morning, another in the ongoing series of programs presented by the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning. The program, through the Northwest Institute of Research, oversees a grant from the Office of Child Development and Early Learning at the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services and the Department of Education. The goal of the program is to improve the outcomes for young children as they prepare for school. John Poza is a community partner specialist for the program, and he's here with us throughout the series. Well, John, we have a guest this morning, right?
That's right, Joe. Good morning. This morning we're welcoming Dr. Camille Dempsey. Dr. Dempsey, who happens to also be my supervisor at the Northwest Regional Key, is born and raised in Erie, Pennsylvania, and she started at the Regional Key as the virtual administrator and technologist when she began last April, and she currently serves as the assistant director where she oversees the technology and communication strategy. Her career has also included experience in higher ed at Mercyhurst University as a professor of education and art, and prior to coming to the Northwest Key, she created her consulting business, Virtuality Consulting, supporting educational organizations and businesses through their technology, arts, and staff development needs. She attended Duquesne University in Pittsburgh and completed her studies there last spring with a doctorate in instructional technology with an emphasis on leadership. And through her research, Camille developed a new theory of virtuality culture where she studies what is happening in the greater culture as it relates to contemporary technology. Good morning, Camille. How are you? And welcome to the program.
Good morning, John. I'm great. How are you?
Very good. Very good. Well, of course, the first question I'm sure a lot of people would want to know is, can you share some of the key points of your research related to your theory of virtuality culture and what that actually means for the early learning community?
Sure. Well, last year, as part of my dissertation, I developed a theory that related to what was happening with the shift that I believe is happening in our greater culture. This comes from, it's an expansion of Walter Ong's work in the area of orality and literacy. So without getting too academic, to boil it down, I believe there's something happening in our culture that we can't explain by, pre-existing, ideas. So that's kind of where it started. And then as far as thinking about what's happening, I think some of the evidence of why I think our culture is evolving in this direction is really evidenced by a lot of the new terms that are popping up that you hear a lot about. So some of the terms like meta literacy and digital media literacy and visual literacy, there's the teleliteracy, there's an abundance of these terms, and I really think it's because literacy and technology are really starting to converge. So as far as children, one of the things that I believe is very exciting is thinking about the ways in which technology mediates these connecting points for children. So whether that's with us, with themselves, of course, that thinking about how contemporary technology mediates these experiences. So it's a wonderful time to think about this impact, and there's certainly a lot of buzz about the ways in which children are using technology.
Well, we talk about technology, and of course, for some of the dinosaurs like Joe and I, we in our own minds kind of identify and with what technology is, but that may not necessarily be the same with younger people today. So if you could, in terms of early learning, can you kind of define how we use the word technology, what it means, and how does technology mediate human presence?
Right. I think there's a lot of debate about how people define technology. I really like how Walter Ong defines it, and I'm not going to read you his definition, but I'll just give you just boil it down. But he really talks about it being a mechanical, some sort of an intervention or a tool that helps us extend the limits of our human capacity, meaning that, from thinking about the way things that technology can do to unlock our potential. He talks about it related to, producing something human. So that's a very different way to look at technology than some of the other definitions you hear out there. And I definitely would subscribe to that. And as far as how technology mediates presence in terms of thinking about human beings, one of the things that I did was outline 3 different ways that I think this happens, particularly when you think about young learners. One of the ways is through what I call primary presence, which is where we think about the ways that children are defined with the technology, that is, through the rules of oral culture. So thinking about, oral, like sound, ways in which they, relate to technology with sound, an example, or sound, or just being present, physically present with their body, with their hands. And one of the ways that's really exciting is through a lot of the haptic touch-based technology that children are exploring. So, thinking about the iPad, that sort of thing. The second type I define as secondary presence, so without reading you all the definitions. And this is the way that technology mediates experiences that are defined by the rules of literacy. So thinking about an example might be a teacher in a class looking at a text or images projected on a whiteboard. So that would be something that would relate to that. And then finally would be the third area of presence, which I call tertiary presence, which is what I believe is defined by the rules of virtuality culture, which is what I talked about before. And this is a real interesting one because it has the dynamic where it's immersive. It does have a huge interactive component, and it does fall back on literacy and orality. So when you're thinking about these features, the ways in which we think about communication and language and technology, this is definitely a very vibrant area to continue to explore. So it has right now, I think this area is what's really, challenging us to think about our children with communication and the ways in which they're interacting with technology.
I am the aforementioned dinosaur, okay, and I still struggle. Like we're doing this on computer now, and I struggle with that. I struggle with my computer at home, and I'm all thumbs texting. But yet I see little kids as young as 3 or 4 navigating through the cyber world. What is it about a child's brain that enables them to grasp technology as rapidly as they do? And until the computer age, were we aware that they had this type of learning ability?
Yeah, it's very interesting when you think about young children and how they're learning, and there certainly is a lot of research about how our brains are being transformed, through a lot of these things. And of course, Mark Prensky's work, he talks about digital natives and immigrants. So, what he talks about is that the natives that were born into the YouTube culture and the Twitter culture, much in the way my daughter was, because of the exposure, because of the ways in which they're interacting with some of the tech, absolutely, they're being impacted in a way that's very different, whereas a lot of us came out of a literacy focus. We grew up with books, we grew up with, our whole system of education was literacy, so it's absolutely having an impact on the way children learn. And it's, like I said, it's such a new field. There's a lot of new research, and of course it's hard to just look at singular studies, which is why time will tell how, virtuality culture and technology, how this is going to impact our children.
Here's the second dinosaur with the question, although I'm not maybe quite as much of a dinosaur as Joe.
Thank you.
But one of the things that I think, and Camille, you and I even have talked to this subject before, is in regards to the literacy aspect is, for a better phrase, book learning or reading and learning through printed word. the pros and cons of now that we have a change with technology, with young children now learning virtually through technology. What are the challenges integrating technology, and how do we know in terms of early learning, and how do we know the benefits one way or the other versus learning and reading language in written word in a book, for instance, versus via technology?
Yeah, good questions, John. I had a student at Mercyhurst a few years ago talking about texting, and I'll lead in and talk about where I think we're going with early learning, and was frustrated and said, everyone walks around with their head down texting, and really, was taking that personally. Why aren't we connecting the way we used to? And I thought it was a really interesting thing, to think about that. And when I talked with him further, we did discuss the ways in which people are connecting. So I don't think it's as much that people are getting away from one another, but we have an abundance of ways to connect, and people are making different choices. Some people are using technology to stay present in certain situations, and others are connecting virtually to other times and places. And of course, with technology, you have anywhere and any place, that you can be connected. Looking at some of the challenges related to, technology and early learning, the early learning field's the slowest of all education levels to adopt technology, and that tells you that there are a lot of challenges. It struggles to keep up with other areas of education, and the reason for that is there are a lot of barriers to integrating technology in the field. According to Peggy Ertmer, who did a lot of work around this area, fear is number one. People, again, and you two were talking about, feeling like you're the dinosaurs. And I think people do have a fear when they're, engaged in something that's so different and so new, that involves risk and learning, and they're kind of uncertain and unsure as to how this is going to help them or mediate something that they don't already do. Lack of training, I could go on and on. Lack of internet, funding, time to plan, equipment, support, unwillingness to change, beliefs about technology and computers. There are a lot of these in early learning. So a lot more research needs to be done in all the areas around the impact of how our culture is changing, and with that, how technology is mediating this change with children. I think we also have the challenge in helping adults understand how they can facilitate meaningful interactions with children around technology. I think when we struggle ourselves, thinking about how that transfers to young children is a big jump for a lot of people.
Going back to the conversation that you had with the young person regarding texting, and that there are now multiple ways to communicate. Still, though, in so many situations, as that person grows older, and one that I can cite would be a job interview, you're going to have to be face-to-face with someone. And I had the same question that person did. With all this texting and tweeting and whatever, are people, especially young people, developing poorer in-person, interpersonal communications abilities in terms of just the spoken language in a social or business situation?
Right. That's a wonderful question to ask. I think what's important in this particular time in our shift in culture, that we understand that all forms of communication are really valuable, and that it's really the context of where we need to apply the choices we're making and the mindfulness and the way we're communicating. And I absolutely agree that, a lot of those rules of, engagement and learning how to speak and interact and use language, which really is part of world culture, is significant. But we do have technologies that have components that fall back on oral, types of characteristics. So I think, it's not a this or that. I think it's just the context in which we're exploring that. And I agree that young people do need just like we all need multimodal, lots of different ways that we use our senses and language, and it's very, very important to live a rich, meaningful life. It's very, very important.
Well, on that note, Camille, what are some of the most common misconceptions about technology? And I know you addressed a little bit of it in early learning. And maybe we can clarify some of the fears and so forth that parents and educators even have in their use of it in the early learning field.
Right. I think about when the internet first started and what people used to say about children. And of course, I was young, and I remember being on the other side of that. And there was a lot of fear about whether or not we should have children going online. And of course, now we've got other interesting challenges with children having smartphones and a lot of these dynamics. But I find some of the conversations are very similar to some of the other technologies that have evolved historically. One of the biggest misconceptions in early learning that I would put out there is that screen time is bad for children. I think it's easy to make a blanket statement in that way, but it really the research on this is so new. There's a lot of conflicting research on the topic around what constitutes screen time. That would be a real big area. Another area that is kind of a misconception is that technology is a threat to our other areas of child development. So, and Joe, you kind of alluded to that. Thinking about, what if that takes the place of some of these other things? And I think that a lot of people, you'll hear this, people referring to technology almost vilifying it, when in reality we have to think about that there's a human being on the other end of what we're using. And so with young children, I do believe technology can be mindfully integrated into other areas of child development, including areas like nature and social emotional learning. There are apps out there that parents and child care providers can use with children in nature. I was using one the other day with my daughter to find out what species of animal is. And so, when you look at parenting and a lot of the early learning, technology is being integrated throughout the day, maybe in short bursts with some people, but there are a lot of misconceptions. It's also transforming the way we think about play with young children. When you think about some of the technologies that are developing right now, one of the most interesting to me has been this evolution, these companies that are creating digital blocks that interact when you put them together. Another technology would be some of the floor projection technology where they project images or other, words or text or whatnot on the floor, and children interact with their bodies. So they're running, and the floor space becomes almost like a mouse, when you're clicking the mouse for a child. So, a lot of the ways we think about play and early learning haven't involved a lot of these new things because they're new. So because it's new, time will tell what impact this will have on children, but it's absolutely having an impact on children with this shift in the culture I've been talking about.
You just mentioned a virtual situation where things are being projected onto a floor or whatever that the child sees. I believe there have been studies that have shown that very young children cannot differentiate between real life and what they see on a screen or, a virtual situation. So is there a danger of a virtual world being confused in the mind of the child with what's real?
Well, I think children blur that line in everything. When they explore clay, I know I came out of an art background as well. Whatever that target of what they're exploring, that becomes the place that they get involved. Ong talks about technology having two different focal points. One is this idea of interiorization. When you watch a musician who is so focused on their music, and we've all talked about this, where you see the musician making these faces and is so engrossed in this inner world. And then technology being this thing that also takes us outside of ourselves. So I think in thinking about how we define technology, I think it's important to think about, how is it that we're using this with young children, And are children using this in a way to connect to themselves? Or are they using this in a way with an adult, to create an interaction or outside of just that relationship with themselves? So I think it's a really complex thing. I think we can't judge, like I said, all the technologies on one particular way of being. It really is the context.
Camille, can you share some ideas for where people can go to follow more about what is happening with the early learning and the shift in culture with the use of technology?
Sure. There's a lot of resources out there that, certainly someone could Google and find. Some of the resources I would mention would be ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education, has an early learning network, which really follows all the cutting-edge things that are happening and does follow the research on children and, how we're involved with technology. There's obviously a position statement, which NACCE and Fred Rogers Center collaborated on, which is a really important one for technology and early learning programs. The Fred Rogers Center has an online early learning environment. It allows you to go online so adults can find digital resources. Certainly Common Sense Media would be another one. I know Chip Donahue recently edited a book that's an interesting one. It's called Technology and Digital Media in the Early Years. So those would be a few resources that I know of out there that people could read or get started on.
And of course, Camille, you and I both went to recently a discussion on the new early childhood assessments that will be taking place probably within the next couple of years, that child care facilities and preschools that are at least going to the Star 3 or renewing at the Star 3 or Star 4 level will have to adapt to. And I know that there's an interesting take and dynamic in terms of how technology is approached in those new assessments. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I think they're, like everyone else in the culture, technology conversations around this and assessment are evolving as well. And I know I had asked one of the assessors to have a conversation about how they're looking at technology moving forward, because, of course, a lot of that will inform the work we do in terms of thinking about quality in early learning. And certainly technology and this shift in virtuality culture should absolutely, it will absolutely be involved in that.
Okay, we have one more minute. And so I wanted to ask you before we close, where can others read more about your work in the area of virtuality, culture theory, and technology?
Right. Well, I believe in keeping up a strong digital presence. I don't know how strong mine is, but my dissertation is online. It's open source, so anyone can read it. You just need to search my name. I also share a lot through social media channels, particularly through Twitter, and my username there is JC Dempsey 3. So if somebody was interested and wanted to follow, I do follow a lot with early learning and technology and lots of other things, and share some content related to my own research. So I welcome conversations, and I'm just so excited to be a part of what's happening.
Well, we are so excited. We were excited to have you here today, of course, and then having you with the Northwest Regional Key, where you've been such a great asset to us in terms of our technology and communication strategies. You are a welcome addition. So I know our time is up, but I wanted to thank you so much for being on the program, Camille.
Thank you so much, John.
And that's our program for today. We'll be back in 2 weeks at this same time. In the meantime, you can go online to learn more at papromiseforchildren.com. For John Posa and the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning, I'm Joe Taylor. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.